Hello, Bucharest. Are we ready for some more participatory vulnerability? Because you're getting some. Um, right, it's lovely to be here with 550 of my closest friends, many of whom I had the privilege of meeting at the last edition of this conference in 2019. And it would not be an overstatement to say that those 2 days changed the whole course of my life. So for that, I want to thank Christy and his incredible team. And as well as all of the other brilliant speakers, it's particularly lovely to get to share a stage with Rhiannon, who I'm very proud and privileged to call a friend and collaborator, and who I'm very glad you all got to meet too. Isn't she incredible, right? So, like Rhiannon, I come from Wales, the country with the second best dragon-based flag in the world. There is Idraigorch, the red dragon, absolute beauty. And I say he because I actually had to Google, is Idraigorch male or female, when I was writing this talk. Sadly, of course, because he comes from less enlightened times, he is a man. That's why I say we have the second best dragon-based flag in the world, because full respect to Bhutan, land of the thunder dragon, it turns out their dragon is queer. It's true. So get this. The dragon on the flag of Bhutan, who's called Druk, by the way, and I'm guessing uses they, them pronouns, of course, is typically considered to represent both male and female energies. You can see the duality there, right? And they symbolize the protective power of deities in Bhutanese mythology. I love Druk. We can only hope, I guess, that Donald Trump and Elon Musk don't find out about the queer Bhutanese dragon, or there's going to be trouble in the Himalayas. So we'll keep Druk between us for now, right? Is that a deal, right? But as well as being Welsh, I'm also Indian. And although I have to admit India's flag has a disappointing lack of dragons, it does contain some equally important and interesting symbolism. So the saffron orange there at the top, that represents courage and sacrifice. The white symbolizes peace and truth. And the green symbolizes faith, chivalry, and hope. The blue chakra, or wheel, in the middle there, represents dharma, which is a really important concept in Indian culture, actually, and spans Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. It doesn't really have a proper translation in English because it's a complex mix of duty, virtue, righteousness, and law. But because I am Indian, I feel it viscerally, really, almost as part of my body. But I haven't always, because I haven't always felt Indian. Now, the theme of this conference is connect, but for huge parts of my life, I felt totally disconnected. And that's where I'm going to start this story. So, this is my father in 1971 with me. You can kind of see the resemblance, can't you, between him and me? Look at his face. I honestly don't know what emotion that's capturing. It's pretty complicated, right? But from spending some time with him over the last 53 years, I can hazard a pretty good guess. It's probably a mix of love, confusion, happiness, pain, and fear. I say confusion because I guess, like any parent, he's wrestling there with the fact that his life has changed forever in the last few days. The things he used to think were important aren't important anymore. The world will never feel the same again, and neither will he. The parents here amongst you all will probably understand far better than me all the emotions that are happening here, because for reasons that might become clear in the next 30 minutes, I deliberately don't have children. If I'm honest, the main reason I don't have children is that I fucking love an afternoon nap. And apparently, having an afternoon nap is something that's simply not possible if you have kids. Sounds absolutely brutal. I cannot recommend that. But I digress. I say that you can see pain and fear here because he's dealing with something different from most other parents, certainly in the 1970s, but perhaps increasingly familiar now. He knows he's going to be bringing up his son in a country which doesn't really want either of them. A country fueled then and now by racism. I can't imagine what that feels like to him, but in a way I don't have to, because I can see it all written there, and now so can you. I do wonder if he could have time-traveled and seen me on this stage, talking to all of you, showing this picture, I wonder what he would have thought. I mean, don't get me wrong, he'd be really disappointed and mainly worried that I turned out to be a journalist. Because like Jackie, there's no ink in my blood. It's a very low-status career in India. I mean, maybe they've got it right. But despite that, I really hope he would think, it's going to be fine. Things turned out okay in the end. So, storytelling is about weaving. It's about bringing together a bunch of disparate threads and intertwining them to create something new, with a distinct texture and feeling all of its own. So I want to do a bit of weaving. So this is actually a photo I took at the last edition of this conference in 2019. Some of you will remember it's the Romanian researcher Ioanida Costaș. That's her with her father too. And I was touched in a very particular way by her talk. She's currently an assistant professor of ethnomusicology at Stanford, and her research explores race, ethnicity, cultural memory, trauma, and history. All things which are entangled in my life too. She talked about how she'd almost been cut off from her Roma cultural and musical heritage because of feelings of shame and simply wanting to fit in. Because of that, she was almost denied the musical inheritance of her father's violin playing. It was almost stolen away from her because of the racism she and her family experienced. It touched me because I'd been through very similar things. And I promised then to tell the story of my parents. And this is me, 5.5 years later, keeping that promise. So this photo was taken when we lived in the very far west of Wales. There are not many people of colour there now, almost 50 years on. So my parents faced difficult questions about culture, language, and tradition. Not just how to pass those on to their children, but if. They eventually decided not to teach me their language, Marathi, because they didn't want me to have an accent when I spoke English. And I want to say, I don't blame them for that decision, by the way, but the reality is it didn't just cut me off from my linguistic and cultural heritage, but also, at some level, taught me my whole identity was somehow unacceptable and wrong. That created a huge disconnect in my life, which I'm only just healing now. So this is me in India, my grandparents. And you can probably guess that here we're celebrating Diwali. It's actually really poignant looking back at this because I noticed the way I've got my hand on my grandfather's arm because I was a bit, well, probably a lot scared, to be honest. But even though I only ever spent maybe a month of my life with him before he died, I knew then instinctively that he would protect me. I'm about 3 years old here, I think, and I next went to India when I was 8, but after that, I refused to go again for more than a decade. The world, and in some way even my own parents, were telling me that part of me was wrong, backward, shameful, and I didn't want to be seen that way. I flattened myself in a vain attempt to be just like everyone else, even though I never could be. Now, you may reasonably have come expecting me to talk about journalism, not my family photo album and flag law. And to be fair, you've got a point, so I'll get to mine in a sec. But first, I'm going to throw in a big disclaimer. I am filled with admiration for the many brave and principled journalists working in contexts like Romania, where press freedom can't be taken for granted, and where simply doing your job in the service of citizens puts you at risk. They and you are my heroes. I'm also filled with admiration for the many brilliant journalists I've had the privilege of sharing this stage with. We know they're all very much part of the solution, not the problem. I know I'm lucky to live in a context where we have the luxury of freedom of speech. But, and you knew there was a but coming, the truth is that every day that freedom is being abused. Because where does racism come from? Where does misogyny come from? Where does transphobia come from? It's a systemic failure of the stories our societies tell ourselves. And where are the key storytellers in society? What are the organizations shaping the civic and democratic sphere? Very often, the organizations of journalism. But the truth is, journalism has routinely abdicated the responsibility it has in not just telling stories, but shaping them. It clothes itself in the comfortable myth of so-called objectivity and pretends it's just reporting on events and not actually creating them. It tells itself, here are the systems of oppression over here, and here is journalism over here, just reporting on those systems objectively and dispassionately. The reality is, of course, that journalism is an intrinsic part of those systems of oppression in many places. We can't just talk glibly about holding power to account if we don't acknowledge our own power and account for how it's used and who for. What the objectivity myth has effectively done is allowed dominant voices, white, male, Western, elite, to set the terms of debate, while dismissing other perspectives as biased or unprofessional. I've personally had to deal with those charges every day of my working life. But what that false neutrality has led to is false balance, where harmful or oppressive views are given undue legitimacy in the name of both sides reporting. It's meant that journalism has too often failed to call racism, misogyny, and climate destruction what they actually are. And it's created a media landscape that too often excludes and alienates the very people it claims to serve. This conference is called The Power of Storytelling for a reason. It's high time that journalism owned and took responsibility for that power and used it responsibly. So those questions my parents had to ask themselves, the dilemmas of whether they could be themselves, whether they could tell me who I really was, whether we would ever spend a day of our lives not feeling rejected or rejecting ourselves, those were not their fault. Those dilemmas came from the stories that were being told around them. Not actually about them, of course, because those stories weren't true and they're not true now. Indeed, they continue to do profound harm. Stories are told about immigrants every day, and every day there are a few more daggers in my heart. And not just my heart, every day those same daggers are placed in the hearts of every child of immigrants, every queer child, every working class child, every disabled child, every child who doesn't fit in. If we can't reclaim our stories from the journalism of the past, then one day our hearts might bleed dry. These are our lives. They have value. And that's why this question is the most important thing in the world to me. So what would we invent if that journalism didn't exist? I did tell you I'd get there eventually. So this is something I've been thinking about and working on for a while, and I'm very clear in my mind now that we have to start from scratch. We have to invent something new. Many, many people, including me, have tried to make the journalism industry which exists better. But the truth is, we've all largely failed because those status quo journalism organizations won't and in fact can't change. That's why I now believe we need to discard the journalism of the past and invent something completely new, not tainted by the formulas and traditions of a bygone age, not tied to failed business models, and not designed to maintain the status quo. I think this is an absolutely critical question for our societies. We already feel the ill winds of authoritarianism and exclusionism blowing across us. So this question isn't about what could we invent. It's not even what should we invent. It's what must we invent. Now, just to explain the terminology a little bit, people often talk quite loosely, I think, about mainstream or legacy media. But these days, I prefer to talk about status quo journalism, because I think that framing is much more precise and captures exactly what the problem is. There are legacy institutions which aren't status quo media, and there are new outlets which are. So I think we need to be clear exactly what we're talking about. The status quo media wants to keep things exactly the same because the way things are suits them just fine. So they're going to keep clinging on to that by their fingernails, even as the world changes around them. But you know who doesn't want things to stay the same? Marginalized people and communities. And guess what? That is most people. Because I want to be clear here, when I'm using marginalized, I use it in the same way as people use disabled in the social model of disability. That's to say, we're marginalized by society and its systems and structures, not by our characteristics. And using that definition, most of us are marginalized, because it's not just people of color, disabled people, LGBTQ plus people who are marginalized by those systems and structures. Sadly, in 2025, women are still marginalized. And by definition, marginalized people need systems change so that we're not marginalized. And guess what? No systems change has ever happened without people taking action. Now, even after I explain all that, some of those status quo journalists still say to me, but it's not our job to inspire action or change. And I have a simple response to them. Are you saying that you want people to do absolutely nothing with the information you give them? Because that sounds like a shit job. And in many ways, much of that status quo journalism is doing a shit job. In some deep listening work I did recently with some of Wales's most marginalised communities, they told us they regard journalism as oppression. What they meant was that they regard journalism as an arm of the state, as talking at them rather than to or for them, and as having the same impact on their lives as the police, and not in a good way. That may sound shocking to many of you, but for them it's most definitely the reality. The truth is that for many people, large swathes of the journalism landscape have a negative impact on their lives, not a positive one. We had quite a positive impact on their lives then. They had fun. So Abdi Yusuf, a community mentor I work with, who's a co-director of the Grange Pavilion with Rhiannon, he put it far more accurately and powerfully than I ever could. He said simply, would you sit through something that was dehumanizing you, not representing you correctly, misrepresenting you? You wouldn't. You would disengage. It's simple. And it is. The way we tell stories matters just as much as the stories we choose to tell, and right now, status quo journalism storytelling structures are failing. So if we want to reimagine storytelling, we can't just patch up the system or try to save journalism. The reality is we need to dismantle, reimagine, and rebuild the structures that have excluded so many people for so long. We need to ask who gets to tell the stories, who decides what's newsworthy, whose voices are heard, and whose are silenced. So let's do some systems change for journalism. And here I'm going to draw very heavily on a project I've been part of called the People's Newsroom. Now, I have the privilege of standing on this stage today, but many, many people are involved in that work. None of us are going to fix any of the multitude of challenges we're facing on our own. And in fact, it's individualism which is creating many of these problems. So what has my story, and indeed their stories, taught us about what we'd invent if journalism didn't exist? Well, like this conference, it would start with care. Care for ourselves and others. It's the next slide. We'd embody generosity. The stories we told would be trauma-informed rather than traumatic, and focused on healing rather than pain. We'd work towards justice while being honest and accountable and owning our mistakes. That would include challenging unjust hierarchies and exploitation, being actively anti-oppressive, working to undo ableism, racism, patriarchy, and centering decolonial narratives. Justice would mean ensuring that those historically harmed by oppressive narratives would finally control what, why, how, and when their stories are shared. We'd finally be able to hold complexity. So one of the defining characteristics of status quo journalism is that it fetishizes simplicity and certainty. And guess what? They are the exact opposite of the way the world actually works. We need to embrace the depth, complexity, and uncertainty of systems and use our stories to make sense of them. We also need to give our people, communities, and societies time to process and sense-make themselves. Now, this is a storytelling conference, so I may be in luck. Are any of you aware of the novelist Philip Pullman? Any of you, hands up? A few. He's actually really famous in the UK and not as famous as I would have thought around the world. So firstly, I recommend you read his series of books, his Dark Materials. They're incredible. But almost 15 years ago now, he started writing about why he thought authors who wrote present tense novels were abdicating their narrative responsibility. What he meant by that was, in a present tense novel, things can just happen randomly. There doesn't have to be a before, and there doesn't even have to be an after. I'm just going to straightforwardly use some quotes from Pullman here, because I have nothing to add, like no notes, Philip. I want all the young present tense storytellers, the old ones have won prizes and are incorrigible, to allow themselves to stand back and show me a wider temporal perspective. I want them to feel able to say what happened, what usually happened, what sometimes happened, what had happened before something else happened, what might happen later, what actually did happen later, and so on, to use the full range of English tenses. If I just relate now, what's happening now, the writer seems to say, I can't be held to account for it. It's the way things are. I'm just standing close to the action as it happens, not editing or anything. It's really real. Does that one in particular remind you of anything? Pullman is talking about novels, of course, but this is the problem with news. We report on individual events at individual points in time, as if there's no before and no after. We take those events out of their systemic context and present them as really real, as truth, when they're not. We need to be able to hold complexity. We also need to be able to hold joy and play. This means leaning into curiosity, learning and unlearning, experimentation. We need to create space for dreaming, imagination, and sensing futures which could be different. If we think of this even in a sort of transactional product thinking way, then the very best products make our lives better, easier, or more fun. It's obvious, right? That's what we want all our products to do. Now, how much journalism makes our lives better, easier, or more fun? Particularly that status quo. People are laughing. It's that bad, right? Not so much, right? So in a similar way, our new journalism needs to be about building power. Our stories need to support us in building knowledge, empathy, power, and agency to trace our pathways from our collective stories into collective action. As I said before, most of us are marginalized, and therefore we need the world to change so that we're not marginalized. So if journalism isn't providing a route to power, agency, and ultimately change, then for many of us, it will remain empty and meaningless. Finally, and of course for many beautiful reasons, this is the theme of this conference. Our new journalism needs to prioritize connection. That means centering, valuing, seeking, and building relationships. It means co-creating stories, equipping each other to tell them, and amplifying the stories we all tell. I think it also means being able to collectively process stories. One of the reasons the news doesn't work, or indeed make any sense, is because it's delivered to us as individuals with no care. Here you are, here's something awful that's happened, we'll just leave you to deal with that on your own. If we want to build healthier relationships and healthier societies together, then we need to be able to process and discuss events, policies, and decisions together. We aren't meant to address society-level problems as individuals, but that's what status quo journalism has forced on us, because it wants the world to stay the same. So those are the 6 building blocks of a new journalism, what I'd invent if journalism didn't exist. They define a journalism built around care, that acknowledges it has a role to play in change, but is absolutely founded on connection. These are fundamentals and will be true forever. They're not the passing fashions that journalism innovation is always chasing. First it was Facebook, then it was Snapchat, then it was Instagram, as if merely being on those platforms rather than telling different stories would be the silver bullet that solved all the industry's problems. First, it was the pivot to video, then it was the pivot away from video. Now it's the pivot back. The latest fashion is news influencers, because status quo journalism organizations see them being popular where they themselves are not. And they think they can just co-opt creators and solve all the problems with the wave of a glittery wand. But as ever, those organizations are taking all the wrong lessons. This isn't about individuals. It's not about personal fucking brands. It's the opposite. As Roxandra made very clear yesterday, it's about community, it's about connection, and it's about accountability. In that deep listening work I mentioned earlier, almost half our group told us they didn't pay their BBC license fee as a protest against the BBC's journalism and not feeling heard. That's against the law, by the way, but they did it anyway because it was their only way of expressing any accountability with the BBC. And despite the fact as a public broadcaster, they saw no other way of expressing their rage about the way stories are told about them and the people they care about. But the most important thing creators are creating is accountability. The comments are their fact check. Followers tell them when they make a mistake or if they misrepresent people or communities, and the way those creators respond dictates whether people follow them or not. Status quo journalism organizations talk about accountability all the time, but never want to be accountable themselves. That's why the new journalism will be founded on accountability. So returning finally to Wales in the 1970s, here you see the people who are currently award-winning journalist and News Innovation Research Fellow of Media Cymru, Shirish Kulkarni, and the editor of BBC News Labs, who happens to be my sister Manjari. There we are. Check out those cuties. Now, people often say to me, isn't it a coincidence that both of you work in journalism innovation? How weird. And I say to them, no, I don't think so. Because the journalism that exists, the journalism that we've lived through, the journalism that we've had to play a part in making, has never even worked for us. I worked at Sky News for almost 15 years, and a senior journalist in that newsroom once said to me, "You don't get racism anymore, do you?" Not as a question, as a statement. Now that's horrifying on many levels, but perhaps the most horrifying is that person gets to decide what's on the news. What does he think when he's faced with a story that's explicitly about racism? What is he thinking when he's making decisions about how to cover Donald Trump? In the morning meeting when I worked at Sky, if I brought up a story about or from Wales, you could see the chorus of eye rolls go around the room. They didn't even care about things that were happening in a country of the United Kingdom, a country they were supposed to be serving, because they didn't care enough about things that were beyond their direct experience. But that's the fucking job of a journalist, to look beyond our own direct experiences, to connect and empathize with other people, and do our best to understand and accurately reflect and represent their experience and experiences. In recent years, the practice of journalism has become completely disconnected from the purpose of journalism. We need to invent something new to reconnect them, to bind us together, and to create something bigger than ourselves. I became a journalist because I simply wanted to be part of making the world a better place. I became a journalist because I wanted to make the world a better place for this boy and all the children like him. By telling the story of his father, I've told my story, but I hope I've also told some of your stories. I told this story to help put him back together, to help put us all back together. So let's not give up. Fuck status quo journalism. This is our journalism. It's for all of us. Let's go build it together. Thank you.